Dark psychology, the hidden tactics of manipulation, understanding, recognizing, and defending against psychological manipulation. Introduction. Somewhere, right now, someone is being manipulated. Not with a weapon, not with force, but with words. A sentence carefully chosen. A silence held just a little too long. A compliment placed at exactly the right moment. And the person being manipulated has no idea it's happening. This is the unsettling truth about dark psychology. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a warning label. It hides inside ordinary conversations, inside relationships, inside workplaces, inside families. And the most skilled manipulators are not cartoon villains twirling a mustache. They are charming. They are likable. Sometimes they are the very people you trust the most. Let's be clear about something from the start. This audiobook is not a manual for becoming a manipulator. It is the opposite. It is a shield. To defend yourself against something, you first have to understand exactly how it works. A soldier who doesn't understand the enemy's strategy cannot defend the castle. In the same way, a person who doesn't understand manipulation tactics cannot protect their own mind. Dark psychology is the study of the darker, more coercive side of human behavior. The tactics people use to control, exploit, deceive, and dominate others for their own benefit. It draws from real psychological research on manipulation, persuasion, narcissism, and coercive control. Some of what we'll discuss comes from criminal psychology, some from workplace studies, some from research on toxic relationships. Over the course of this audiobook, we'll explore the core manipulation tactics used by con artists, toxic partners, cult leaders, corrupt bosses, and everyday manipulators alike. We'll look at gaslighting, love bombing, the silent treatment, triangulation, guilt tripping, and the dark personality traits that make certain people especially dangerous. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, together known as the dark triad. And by the end, you will not just understand these tactics intellectually, you will start recognizing them in your own life. In a coworker who always seems to twist your words, in a partner who apologizes but never actually changes, in a friend who always makes you feel slightly guilty for having boundaries. This knowledge is power. Not power to control others, but power to no longer be controlled. Let's begin. Part 1. What is dark psychology? To understand manipulation, we first need to understand what separates it from normal, healthy influence. Every single day, humans influence one another. A friend convinces you to try a new restaurant. A teacher inspires you to study harder. An advertisement persuades you to buy a product. This is normal. This is how social life functions. Manipulation is different. The core distinction lies in one word: consent. Healthy influence respects your right to say no. It presents information, makes a case, and lets you decide freely. Manipulation, on the other hand, works by bypassing your rational judgment. It exploits emotion, fear, guilt, or confusion to get you to do something you would not otherwise choose to do. And often, you don't even realize it happened. Curious. Think about the difference this way. If someone says, "I think you'd enjoy this movie because you like the director's last film," that's influence. If someone says, "If you really loved me, you'd watch this movie with me instead of going out with your friends," that's manipulation. The second sentence doesn't offer a reason. It offers guilt as a weapon. Psychologists who study this field often point to 3 interlocking personality traits that predict manipulative behavior. Together, these 3 form what's called the dark triad. The first is narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy for others. Narcissists don't see people as equals. They see them as an audience, or as tools. The second is Machiavellianism, named after the 16th century political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, who wrote about acquiring and maintaining power through cunning and strategy. A person high in Machiavellianism is calculating, strategic, and views relationships transactionally, always asking, what can this person do for me? The third, and most dangerous, is psychopathy, characterized by a lack of remorse, impulsivity, and a chilling absence of emotional attachment to others. Not every psychopath is a criminal. In fact, research suggests that certain corporate and political environments can actually reward psychopathic traits, charm, fearlessness, ruthlessness, with promotions and power. Now, it's important to say this clearly. Most manipulators are not clinical psychopaths. Most people who manipulate others do so out of insecurity, fear, learned behavior from childhood, or simple habit. A person raised in a chaotic household where manipulation was the only way to get needs met will often carry those same tactics into adulthood without any conscious malice. Understanding this doesn't excuse manipulative behavior, but it does help us see that not every manipulator is a monster. Some are simply using broken tools they were handed a long time ago. That said, some manipulators are fully aware of what they're doing. They plan it. They calculate it. And these are the ones this audiobook will help you recognize most clearly. It's also worth understanding where these tendencies come from developmentally. Research on attachment and personality formation suggests that many people who grow up to rely heavily on manipulation tactics experienced inconsistent caregiving in childhood, a parent who was warm one day and cold the next, love that felt conditional on performance or compliance. In that kind of environment, a child learns, often without any conscious choice, that direct, honest communication doesn't reliably get needs met, but strategic behavior, charm, guilt, withdrawal, does. By adulthood, these strategies have hardened into automatic habits, deployed long before conscious thought even enters the picture. This doesn't mean every manipulator had a difficult childhood, and it certainly doesn't mean every difficult childhood produces a manipulator. But understanding these roots helps explain something important. Why manipulation so often feels intuitive and effortless to the person using it. It isn't necessarily a cold, calculated performance every single time. For many manipulators, it's simply the only relational language they've ever deeply known. There's one more distinction worth making clear before we go further: the difference between manipulation and healthy assertiveness, because the two are sometimes confused. Assertiveness means stating your needs, feelings, and boundaries directly and honestly, even when doing so might disappoint someone. "I need some space tonight. I've had an exhausting day," is assertive. It's honest, direct, and respects the other person's ability to respond however they choose. Manipulation, by contrast, always involves some degree of concealment or distortion, hiding the true motive behind a request, or distorting the emotional stakes to force a particular response. Learning to tell these apart, in yourself and in others, is one of the most valuable skills this audiobook can offer you. Part 2. The Dark Triad: Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and Psychopathy. Now let's go deeper into the personalities most likely to use these tactics. Not casually, not accidentally, but as a core operating strategy for navigating the world. Psychologists call this cluster of traits the Dark Triad, first formally identified by researchers Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams in 2002. Let's start with narcissism. Clinical narcissism, in its extreme form, is a diagnosable personality disorder. But narcissistic traits exist on a spectrum, and many people display significant narcissistic tendencies without meeting full clinical criteria. The defining features are grandiosity, an excessive need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy. Narcissists often present two faces to the world. There's the grandiose narcissist, confident, charming, dominant, quick to take center stage in any room. And there's the vulnerable narcissist, fragile, easily offended, prone to seeing themselves as constantly victimized, yet equally self-centered underneath the surface. Both types share the same core, an inability to genuinely see other people as fully real, separate individuals with their own needs, rather than as extensions of the narcissist's own ego. What makes narcissists particularly effective manipulators, at least initially, is their remarkable charm. Studies on narcissistic charisma show that people high in narcissistic traits often make excellent first impressions. They're confident, entertaining, quick with compliments, seemingly self-assured in a way that many people find magnetic. The damage, unfortunately, tends to reveal itself only over time, once the person is already emotionally invested. Next is Machiavellianism, named, as we mentioned, after the political philosopher Machiavelli. People high in this trait view the world as a chessboard and other people as pieces to be strategically maneuvered. Unlike narcissists, who are driven primarily by ego and admiration, Machiavellians are driven by pragmatic self-interest. They're not necessarily seeking constant praise. They're seeking advantage, resources, and control, and they'll calculate the most efficient path to get there, often including deception, flattery, or strategic alliances that will be abandoned the moment they're no longer useful. Finally, psychopathy, the most severe and, statistically, the least common of the three traits, though its impact can be the most devastating. Psychopathy is characterized by a profound lack of remorse, superficial charm, impulsivity, and what researchers describe as a fundamental deficit in emotional processing. Psychopaths do not experience fear, guilt, or empathy the way most people do, which allows them to deceive, exploit, and harm others without the internal resistance that would stop most people. It's worth noting something important here. Not all psychopathic individuals are violent criminals. Research by psychologist Robert Hare, who developed the widely used psychopathy checklist, suggests that certain corporate and political environments may actually select for psychopathic traits, because charm, fearlessness, and a willingness to make ruthless decisions without emotional hesitation can, in certain competitive contexts, be mistaken for strong leadership. How does understanding the dark triad help you in daily life? It helps you recognize patterns rather than isolated incidents. A single lie doesn't necessarily indicate a dark triad personality, but a consistent, repeated pattern. Charm, followed by exploitation. Strategic alliance followed by abandonment. Complete absence of guilt after causing clear harm. These patterns, taken together over time, are far more diagnostic than any single event. The most important practical takeaway is this: dark triad individuals are exceptionally skilled at making excellent first impressions. Charm, in isolation, tells you almost nothing about someone's true character. What matters far more is how a person treats people who have no power over them. A waiter, a stranger who accidentally bumps into them, a subordinate at work who can offer them nothing in return. Character reveals itself most clearly in these low-stakes interactions, precisely because they aren't being performed for strategic benefit. Researchers have also identified an important variable that ties all three dark triad traits together: a personality dimension called low agreeableness, combined with low honesty humility, sometimes referred to in the academic literature simply as the H factor. People who score low on this combined dimension tend to view fairness and honesty as tools to be used strategically rather than values to be upheld consistently. This helps explain why dark triad individuals can seem perfectly honest and fair in situations where honesty benefits them, while abandoning those same principles instantly the moment deception becomes more advantageous. Curious. One particularly useful, practical test that psychologists studying manipulation often recommend is what might be called the consistency test. Does this person's behavior remain the same, regardless of who is watching, and regardless of what they stand to gain? A person of genuine good character behaves similarly, whether or not anyone is observing them, whether or not the interaction benefits them directly. A dark triad personality, by contrast, often displays a noticeable, sometimes jarring shift in behavior depending on audience and incentive, warm and generous in front of others, cold and dismissive in private, extraordinarily charming towards someone who can offer career advancement, dismissive towards someone who cannot. It's also worth noting that dark triad traits exist on a continuum, not as a strict category you either belong to or don't. Nearly everyone displays some degree of these traits in certain moments. A flash of self-interest, a small manipulation to avoid conflict, a moment of insufficient empathy under stress. What distinguishes a genuinely dangerous personality isn't the occasional lapse, but the consistency, intensity, and complete absence of guilt with which these traits are deployed as a primary life strategy. Part 3. Gaslighting. Rewriting your reality. If there is one manipulation tactic that has become infamous in modern psychology, it's gaslighting. The term comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband slowly manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her mind, dimming the gas-powered lights in their home and then denying that the light ever changed, convincing her that her own perception is unreliable. Gaslighting, in essence, is the systematic effort to make someone doubt their own memory, perception, or sanity. It is one of the cruelest forms of manipulation because it doesn't just control your behavior, it attacks your ability to trust yourself. Imagine this scenario. A woman tells her partner, "You said you'd pick me up at 6, and you never showed up." Her partner responds calmly, without hesitation. "I never said that. You always do this. You make things up, and then get upset with me for something I never said." Now, she genuinely remembers the conversation. But his confidence, his total lack of doubt, makes her pause. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe she's overreacting. Maybe she really does have a bad memory, like he says she does, because he's told her this many times before. This is the mechanism of gaslighting, repetition combined with unwavering confidence. The gaslighter doesn't need to be right. They simply need to sound more certain than you feel. Gaslighting typically unfolds in stages. In the beginning, it's small, denying a minor detail. "I never said that," or "That's not what happened." The victim at this stage usually brushes it off, assuming a simple misunderstanding. Over time, the denials grow bigger and more frequent. Eventually, the victim starts to preemptively doubt their own memory before even bringing something up. They start saying things like, "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong," even before the manipulator has said a single word. This is the terrifying end goal of gaslighting, creating a person who no longer trusts their own mind, and therefore depends entirely on the manipulator's version of reality. Once this dependency is established, the manipulator gains enormous control because the victim can no longer trust their own judgment enough to leave, to object, or even to recognize the abuse for what it is. Gaslighting isn't limited to romantic relationships. It happens in workplaces. A boss who denies giving an instruction, then blames the employee for not following directions. It happens in families. A parent who denies a child's traumatic memory, insisting, "That never happened. You're too sensitive." It even happens at a societal level, where institutions or public figures deny well-documented events, hoping that repetition and confidence will override collective memory. So how do you protect yourself against gaslighting? The single most effective tool is external documentation. Keep a journal. Write down conversations, dates, agreements, immediately after they happen. This isn't paranoia. It's simply building an anchor to reality that exists outside your own memory, one that a manipulator cannot rewrite. The second defense is trusting your emotional reaction, even when you can't fully articulate why something feels wrong. If a conversation consistently leaves you confused, apologetic, or doubting yourself, even when you can't pinpoint exactly what happened, that feeling itself is data. Manipulation often works below the level of conscious awareness before it reaches conscious thought. The third defense is seeking outside perspective. Gaslighting thrives in isolation. Talking to a trusted friend, a therapist, or even writing your own account of events and reading it back later breaks the manipulator's monopoly on your sense of reality. It's worth adding one more layer of nuance here. Not everyone who denies your version of events is gaslighting you. Genuine memory differences happen constantly between people, even in the healthiest relationships. Two people can walk away from the exact same conversation with slightly different recollections, without either one lying. The distinguishing feature of true gaslighting isn't the disagreement itself. It's the pattern, the intent, and the effect. Gaslighting is characterized by repeated, consistent denial, specifically aimed at destabilizing your confidence in your own mind, and it leaves you feeling progressively more anxious, more dependent, and less certain of your own perceptions over time. A simple, honest memory disagreement, by contrast, gets resolved through conversation and doesn't leave you doubting your basic grip on reality afterward.
There's also a subtler, more insidious form of gaslighting worth naming, what some therapists call trivializing gaslighting. This doesn't deny that an event happened, but instead denies its significance. "You're way too sensitive, it was just a joke," or "you're making a huge deal out of nothing," are classic examples. Here, the manipulator isn't rewriting the facts of what happened, but rather rewriting your right to feel hurt by them. Over time, this form of gaslighting can be just as damaging as outright denial, because it teaches the victim to distrust their own emotional responses, not just their memories.
Part 3, Love Bombing, the Seductive Opening Move. Here's an uncomfortable truth: the most dangerous manipulators rarely start with cruelty. They start with overwhelming, intoxicating affection. This tactic is known as love bombing, and it is one of the most effective opening moves in the manipulator's playbook, precisely because it feels wonderful. Love bombing is the practice of showering someone with excessive attention, affection, gifts, compliments, and declarations of love, far earlier and far more intensely than a healthy relationship would normally develop. A person you met 2 weeks ago calls you their soulmate. Someone showers you with expensive gifts before you've even had a real conversation about your values. A new partner wants to spend every single hour with you, texts you constantly, tells you no one has ever understood them the way you do. It feels incredible. It feels like finally being seen, finally being chosen, finally mattering to someone completely. And that is exactly the point. Love bombing serves two strategic purposes for a manipulator. First, it creates a rapid emotional bond, one so intense that the victim becomes attached before they've had time to properly evaluate the person's character. Second, and more insidiously, it establishes a reference point, a peak of affection that the victim will spend the rest of the relationship trying to get back to, even as the manipulator's behavior deteriorates. This is where the trap closes. After the initial phase of love bombing, manipulators, especially those with narcissistic traits, typically begin to withdraw affection, introduce criticism, or become cold and distant. This creates a disorienting whiplash for the victim, who was just recently treated like the most important person in the world. The natural, human response is to think, what did I do wrong? How do I get back to how things were? And so the victim starts working harder, changing themselves, tolerating more, all in pursuit of recapturing that initial high. Psychologists sometimes compare this pattern to a slot machine. If a slot machine paid out every single time, you'd stop finding it exciting. It's the unpredictability, the intermittent reinforcement, that creates addiction. A relationship that swings between overwhelming affection and cold withdrawal creates the exact same psychological hook. The victim becomes emotionally addicted to a cycle, chasing highs that become increasingly rare, tolerating lows that become increasingly severe.
How do you recognize love bombing before you're caught in its cycle? The clearest warning sign is speed. Genuine intimacy, genuine trust, takes time to build. It requires witnessing how a person behaves under stress, how they treat people who can do nothing for them, how they handle disagreement. If someone is declaring profound love, talking about a shared future, or making major commitments within days or weeks of meeting you, that speed itself is information, regardless of how good it feels. Another warning sign is exclusivity pressure. Early love bombing often includes subtle attempts to isolate you from friends and family. I just want you all to myself, or your friends don't understand our connection like I do. This isn't romantic. It's often the first step toward isolation, a tactic we'll discuss in more depth later. The healthiest response to overwhelming, rapid affection is not to reject it outright, but to slow it down deliberately. Healthy people, people with genuinely good intentions, will respect a slower pace. Manipulators, on the other hand, often respond to a request to slow down with guilt, pressure, or even anger, which itself reveals a great deal about their true character. Part 4. The silent treatment and emotional withdrawal. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from what someone says, but from what they refuse to say. The silent treatment, deliberately ignoring, withdrawing communication from, or emotionally freezing out another person, is one of the oldest and most psychologically damaging manipulation tactics in existence. On the surface, it looks passive. No shouting, no accusations, nothing anyone could point to as clearly wrong. But underneath, it is an act of profound control. Research on social exclusion shows that being ignored activates the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain. In other words, the silent treatment doesn't just feel bad metaphorically. The human brain processes social rejection through mechanisms remarkably similar to physical injury. Manipulators use the silent treatment for several reasons. Sometimes it functions as punishment, a way to make someone suffer for a perceived wrongdoing without ever having to explain or justify the punishment itself. Sometimes it functions as control, creating such unbearable anxiety and uncertainty in the other person that they will do almost anything, apologize for almost anything, just to end the silence. And sometimes, more subtly, it functions as a power display, demonstrating that the manipulator holds the emotional keys to the relationship and can withhold connection at will. What makes the silent treatment so effective as a manipulation tool is the uncertainty it creates. If someone tells you directly why they're upset, you can address the issue, apologize if warranted, or defend yourself if you believe you did nothing wrong. But silence gives you nothing to work with. Your mind starts filling in the blanks, usually with your own worst fears. Did I do something terrible? Are they going to leave me? Am I a bad person? This mental spiral is precisely what gives the silent treatment its power. The victim ends up doing the manipulator's emotional work for them, spiraling into self-blame without any actual accusation being made. This tactic is particularly common in what psychologists called punishing withdrawal, distinct from a healthy need for space. There is an important difference here that deserves emphasis. Sometimes, a person genuinely needs time to calm down before discussing a conflict productively, and that is healthy, even necessary. The difference lies in communication and duration. A healthy pause sounds like, "I need an hour to cool down, then let's talk." A manipulative silent treatment offers no timeline, no explanation, and can last for days, sometimes weeks, specifically designed to maximize the other person's anxiety and eventual capitulation. How do you protect yourself against this tactic? First, recognize the pattern for what it is, a control mechanism, not evidence of your own wrongdoing. Second, resist the urge to chase. Manipulators often expect, even depend on, the other person begging for reconciliation, apologizing repeatedly, or over-explaining themselves. Refusing to engage in that chase, calmly stating, "I'm here when you're ready to talk, but I won't chase an apology out of you," disrupts the entire mechanism. Third, and perhaps most importantly, recognize that repeated use of the silent treatment as a conflict resolution strategy is itself a red flag about the relationship's health, regardless of who is right in any individual disagreement. Part 5: Guilt Tripping and the Weaponization of Empathy. Empathy is one of humanity's most beautiful qualities. It's the ability to feel what another person feels, to care about their suffering as though it were your own. And tragically, it is also one of the most exploitable qualities a person can have. Guilt tripping is the manipulation tactic of inducing feelings of guilt in someone in order to influence their behavior, even when that guilt is entirely unwarranted. It works precisely because kind, empathetic people are the most susceptible to it. A manipulator identifies this kindness not as a virtue to be respected, but as a lever to be pulled. The mechanics of guilt tripping often follow a familiar script. A parent says to an adult child, "I guess I'll just spend the holidays alone then, don't worry about me." A partner says, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." A friend says, "I thought you were different from everyone else who's abandoned me." Notice what these sentences have in common. None of them state a clear request. Instead, they imply suffering, imply abandonment, and leave the listener to fill in the guilt themselves. There's a particularly insidious variant of this tactic called playing the victim. A skilled manipulator, when confronted about their own harmful behavior, will pivot the conversation to position themselves as the true victim of the situation. If you calmly point out that someone hurt your feelings, they might respond with, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking me right now, after the day I've had." Suddenly, you find yourself comforting the very person who wronged you, and your original grievance is completely forgotten. This works because most people have an instinctive, deeply ingrained aversion to seeing others suffer, and manipulators exploit this instinct ruthlessly. The tragic irony is that the very trait that makes someone a good, compassionate person is the trait most efficiently weaponized against them. Guilt tripping is especially common in family dynamics, where obligation and love are often deliberately blurred together. A parent might say, "I carried you for 9 months, the least you can do is call me every day. conflating a biological fact with an ongoing emotional debt that can never actually be repaid. This creates what therapists sometimes call toxic obligation, a sense of duty rooted not in genuine care, but in manufactured debt. So how do you defend against guilt tripping? The first step is learning to separate genuine responsibility from manufactured guilt. Ask yourself a simple question: did I actually do something wrong here, based on my own values, or am I simply being made to feel bad for setting a boundary? These are fundamentally different situations, even though they can feel identical in the moment. The second defense is recognizing manipulative phrasing itself. Statements that imply suffering without making a direct, specific request are almost always guilt-tripping rather than honest communication. A healthy request sounds like, "I'd really love it if you visited more often. Could we plan something?" A guilt trip sounds like, "I guess I just don't matter to you anymore." Learning to hear the difference, in real time, is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. The third defense is simply allowing discomfort to exist without immediately resolving it through compliance. Sitting with someone else's disappointment, without rushing to fix it by abandoning your own boundaries, is one of the hardest, and most liberating, psychological skills a person can build. It's also worth understanding why some people are so much more vulnerable to guilt tripping than others. Research on people-pleasing behavior consistently points to a pattern learned early in life. Children who received love and approval conditionally, based on meeting others' emotional needs rather than expressing their own, often grow into adults who equate their own worth with their ability to make others happy. For these individuals, someone else's disappointment doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it can feel like an existential threat to their sense of being a good person at all. Manipulators, whether consciously or not, often gravitate toward exactly these individuals, because the guilt lever is so much more powerful and reliable when pulled on someone already primed to feel excessive responsibility for others' emotions. A particularly useful practical tool for defending against guilt tripping is what therapists sometimes call the broken record technique, calmly repeating your boundary using the same words, without escalating, justifying excessively, or getting pulled into a debate about whether your boundary is reasonable. If someone says, "I guess I'll just be alone for the holidays then," a broken record response might simply be, "I'm sorry you're disappointed, and I'll still be visiting in the spring like we planned." No lengthy justification, no elaborate defense, simply a calm, repeated statement of the actual boundary, refusing to be drawn into a debate whose real purpose is to erode your resolve through sheer emotional exhaustion.
Part 6. Triangulation. The manipulation of three. Most manipulation tactics we've discussed so far involve two people, but some of the most sophisticated forms of manipulation require a third party, a technique known as triangulation. Triangulation is the deliberate introduction of a third person into a conflict or relationship dynamic in order to manipulate, control, or create insecurity. It can take many forms: comparing a partner unfavorably to an ex, telling one friend what another friend supposedly said about them, or a parent pitting siblings against one another for favor and attention. One of the most common romantic versions of triangulation involves the manipulator repeatedly mentioning an ex-partner, a co-worker, or an admirer, not because that person is actually relevant to the relationship, but specifically to create jealousy and insecurity. "My ex never complained about this," or "Someone at work said I look great today." Statements seemingly casual on the surface, but strategically designed to make the current partner feel replaceable and therefore easier to control. Triangulation works through a specific psychological mechanism. It exploits our deeply wired fear of social exclusion. Humans evolved in small tribal groups, where being cast out meant almost certain death. That evolutionary fear of being replaced, excluded, or devalued in comparison to others remains powerfully active in the modern brain, even in contexts as mundane as a romantic relationship or a friend group. In workplace settings, triangulation often appears as a manager comparing employees against one another. Sarah finished her project early. Why couldn't you? Creating competition and insecurity rather than addressing performance directly and constructively. In family systems, a parent might tell one child, "Your sister never talks back to me like you do," fostering resentment between siblings while positioning the parent as the sole arbiter of approval. A particularly cruel variant of triangulation involves the manipulator telling person A that person B said something hurtful about them, when in reality, person B said no such thing, or said something entirely different, twisted through the manipulator's retelling. This creates conflict between A and B, while the manipulator remains at the center, controlling information, often positioning themselves as the only trustworthy source between two people who no longer trust each other. How do you defend against triangulation? First, resist comparison as a legitimate basis for changing your behavior. If someone says, "So-and-so would never do this," recognize this as a manipulation tactic rather than valid feedback, and respond to the substance of any actual concern, not the comparison itself. Second, whenever possible, seek direct communication rather than relying on secondhand reports. If you hear that someone said something about you, and it's important, go to that person directly, rather than accepting the manipulator's version of events as truth. This simple habit alone destroys the mechanism of triangulation, because it removes the manipulator's monopoly on the flow of information. Third, recognize that healthy relationships do not require jealousy or competition to function. If someone must constantly invoke other people to manage your behavior, that itself is diagnostic of a manipulative dynamic rather than a healthy one.
Part 8. Isolation Tactics and Controlling the Information Supply. Every skilled manipulator, whether in an intimate relationship, a workplace, or even a cult, understands one foundational principle: control is far easier to maintain when the target has fewer outside perspectives to compare it against. This is why isolation is one of the most consistent and most dangerous tactics across every category of manipulation we've discussed. Isolation rarely announces itself directly. No manipulator says, "I am now going to cut you off from your support system." Instead, it happens gradually, often disguised as care, concern, or even romantic devotion. "I just don't think your friends really understand you," or "Your family has always been toxic, I'm the only one who's ever really been there for you," or "We don't need anyone else, we have each other." Each of these statements, in isolation, might even be partially true in some contexts. Some friendships genuinely are toxic. Some families genuinely are dysfunctional. This is precisely what makes isolation tactics so effective. They're often built on a kernel of plausible truth, which makes the broader manipulation harder to recognize and resist over time, as outside relationships fade, sometimes through direct discouragement, sometimes through subtle guilt, sometimes through the manipulator creating so much conflict or drama around outside relationships that maintaining them becomes exhausting. The victim becomes increasingly dependent on the manipulator for emotional support, validation, and even their basic understanding of reality. This is precisely the isolation gaslighting connection. Once someone has no outside perspective to check their reality against, gaslighting becomes exponentially more effective. This same principle operates in cult psychology, extensively studied by researchers like Robert Cialdini and Margaret Singer. cult leaders systematically encourage, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, the severing of ties with family, friends, and any outside institution that might challenge the group's worldview. This isn't incidental to cult dynamics, it is, in fact, one of the central mechanisms through which cults maintain control over members, because a person surrounded exclusively by one worldview, with no outside comparison, gradually loses the ability to critically evaluate that worldview at all. Isolation also appears in workplace manipulation, though in subtler forms. A manipulative boss might discourage employees from discussing salary or working conditions with each other, framing it as unprofessional or against company culture, when in reality, this isolation prevents employees from comparing notes and recognizing patterns of unfair treatment. How do you protect yourself against isolation tactics? The most powerful defense is intentional relationship maintenance, deliberately keeping multiple sources of connection, feedback, and perspective active in your life, even when a new relationship feels all-consuming and wonderful. Healthy partners, friends, and employers do not feel threatened by your other relationships. They understand that a person with a rich support network is not a person to be won away from others, but a whole person to be added to, not subtracted from. A second defense is noticing the framing used to discourage outside relationships. There's a meaningful difference between someone saying, "I've noticed that friendship seems to leave you feeling drained, want to talk about it," and someone saying, "You need to stop seeing them." The first respects your autonomy. The second seeks to control it. There's also a financial dimension to isolation that deserves specific mention, because it's often overlooked. Controlling access to money, transportation, or independent resources is one of the most powerful, and most under-discussed, isolation tactics, sometimes called financial abuse in the clinical literature. A manipulator might insist on managing all shared finances, discourage a partner from working or maintaining independent income, or create a situation where leaving becomes practically difficult, not just emotionally difficult. This form of isolation is particularly dangerous because it doesn't rely on words at all, it relies on structural dependency, making the emotional manipulation nearly irrelevant, because even a victim who fully recognizes the manipulation may feel they have no practical way to act on that recognition. A third, often overlooked defense against isolation is maintaining independent access to information, your own email account, your own social media, your own understanding of shared finances and important documents. Manipulators sometimes seek to insert themselves as the sole intermediary for a victim's access to the outside world, whether through controlling devices, monitoring communications, or simply positioning themselves as the one who handles all outside interactions. Preserving your own independent access to information and resources is not paranoid, it's a basic form of psychological and practical self-preservation. Part 9. Projection, Deny Attack Reverse, and Flipping the Script. Curious, one of the most disorienting experiences in dealing with a skilled manipulator is the strange sensation of ending up on the defensive, even when you were the one who raised a legitimate concern. This isn't an accident. It's a specific, well-documented manipulation pattern known as DARVO, an acronym for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender, coined by psychologist Jennifer Freyd. Here's how DARVO typically unfolds. You confront someone about a specific harmful behavior, say that they lied to you about something significant. Step 1. Deny, "I never lied to you, that's ridiculous." Step 2. Attack, "Actually, you're the one who's been distant lately, maybe you're just looking for reasons to be upset with me." Step 3. Reverse, "I can't believe after everything I've done for you, you're accusing me of something like this. I'm the one who should be hurt right now." By the end of this exchange, the original concern has completely vanished, replaced by you defending yourself against accusations that emerged only after you raised a legitimate issue. This is an extraordinarily effective manipulation pattern precisely because it happens so quickly, and because most people, in the moment, feel an instinctive urge to address the newest accusation rather than returning to the original point. Closely related to DARVO is the psychological concept of projection, attributing one's own unacceptable feelings, behaviors, or flaws onto someone else. A person who is being unfaithful might become intensely, unreasonably suspicious that their partner is cheating on them. A person who lies frequently might constantly accuse others of being dishonest. This isn't necessarily conscious deception. Psychologists suggest that projection often serves as an unconscious defense mechanism, allowing a person to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves by relocating those truths onto someone else. Understanding projection helps explain a confusing pattern many people experience, being accused of exactly the behavior the accuser is actually engaging in. If a partner constantly, without evidence, accuses you of manipulation, deception, or disloyalty, it's worth considering, calmly and without becoming defensive yourself, whether these accusations might reveal more about the accuser's own behavior than about yours. How do you defend against DARVO and projection? The single most important skill is staying anchored to the original issue. When a conversation begins to spiral into counter-accusations, it's entirely reasonable to say, calmly, I hear that you have concerns too, and we can discuss those, but first, let's finish addressing the original issue I raised. This simple redirection, repeated as many times as necessary, prevents the conversation from being hijacked entirely. A second defense is recognizing the emotional signature of DARVO in real time, the sudden, disorienting shift from raising a concern to defending yourself. That specific feeling of whiplash is itself diagnostic information, even before you've consciously identified the manipulation tactic being used. Part 10. How to build psychological defenses against manipulation. We've now explored some of the most powerful, most common manipulation tactics used by dark personalities: gaslighting, love bombing, the silent treatment, guilt tripping, triangulation, isolation, and DARVO. Understanding each tactic individually is valuable. But building a genuine, lasting defense requires developing broader psychological habits that protect you across every situation, not just the specific patterns we've named. The first, and arguably most important, defense is developing strong internal validation. Manipulators thrive on external dependency, making you rely on their approval, their version of events, their emotional temperature, to determine your own sense of self-worth and reality. The antidote is cultivating a stable internal sense of your own values, memories, and worth, one that doesn't require constant external confirmation to remain intact. The second defense is learning to trust the slow accumulation of patterns over the persuasive power of any single moment. Manipulators are often extraordinarily skilled in individual interactions, charming, articulate, convincing. But patterns don't lie the way individual moments can. If you find yourself consistently confused, apologetic, anxious, or diminished after interacting with a specific person, that pattern matters more than any single conversation where they seemed perfectly reasonable. The third defense is maintaining what we might call an outside anchor, at least one person, ideally several, who know you well, who you trust completely, and who can offer honest, unfiltered perspective on your relationships and decisions. This single habit undermines nearly every manipulation tactic we've discussed, because isolation is the soil in which most manipulation grows, and an outside anchor keeps that soil from ever fully forming. The fourth defense is learning to sit with discomfort without immediately resolving it through compliance. Much of manipulation's power comes from creating an unbearable emotional state, guilt, anxiety, fear of abandonment, that the victim desperately wants to escape, and compliance offers the fastest escape route. Learning to tolerate that discomfort, even briefly, without immediately giving in, breaks this cycle at its source. The fifth defense is documentation, particularly in situations involving gaslighting or repeated denial of events. Keeping a simple, private record of significant conversations, agreements, and incidents creates an anchor to reality that exists independent of anyone's memory or persuasive confidence. The sixth defense, and perhaps the most difficult, is accepting that recognizing manipulation in someone you love does not obligate you to immediately confront, fix, or leave them. Sometimes recognition is simply the first step, a quiet internal shift that allows you to set boundaries, protect your own reality, and make decisions from a place of clarity rather than confusion, even while a relationship continues. Softly, finally, it's worth remembering something important: not every difficult behavior is manipulation, and not every person who occasionally guilt trips you or goes quiet during conflict is a dark triad personality. Human beings are imperfect. We all, at various points, communicate poorly, react defensively, or fall short of our best selves. The distinction that matters is pattern versus incident, and intent versus mistake. Someone who occasionally struggles to communicate and genuinely works to improve is fundamentally different from someone who systematically, repeatedly uses these tactics as their primary mode of relating to others. This distinction matters enormously, because the goal of this knowledge is not to become suspicious of everyone around you, turning every disagreement into evidence of dark psychology. The goal is precision, learning to recognize genuine, pattern manipulation clearly enough that you can protect yourself from it, while still remaining open, trusting, and connected to the many people in your life who deserve that trust. There's one final, practical framework worth carrying with you, one that ties everything in this audiobook together, what we might call the 3 Ps of evaluating any relationship dynamic that feels off. Pattern: is this a repeated behavior, or an isolated incident? Purpose: does this behavior seem to serve the other person's control or comfort at the direct expense of yours? And proportion: is the emotional reaction being demanded of you proportionate to what actually happened, or does it feel manufactured, exaggerated, or manipulated into existence? Running any confusing interaction through these 3 questions, calmly and honestly, will clarify far more than any single conversation ever could in the moment. It's also worth saying something about self-compassion here, because many people who have experienced manipulation carry a heavy, unearned burden of shame, a sense that they should have seen it coming, that they were foolish for trusting, that they somehow deserved what happened to them. None of this is true. Skilled manipulators are, by definition, skilled. They specifically target kindness, empathy, and trust, qualities that reflect well on the people who possess them, not weaknesses to be ashamed of. Recognizing manipulation after the fact is not a sign of foolishness. It is a sign of growth, awareness, and increasing psychological strength, the very qualities that will protect you far more effectively going forward. Conclusion: we've traveled through some of the darkest corners of human psychology in this audiobook: the calculated charm of the narcissist, the disorienting fog of gaslighting, the intoxicating trap of love bombing, the silent cruelty of emotional withdrawal, the exploitation of empathy through guilt, the strategic chaos of triangulation, and the quiet, gradual tightening of isolation. None of this knowledge is meant to make you cynical or afraid of connection. Quite the opposite. Understanding manipulation clearly is what allows you to tell the difference between a person who occasionally makes a mistake and a person who has built an entire strategy around exploiting your kindness. It's what allows you to trust more freely, precisely because you're no longer trusting blindly. The people who manipulate others successfully depend on one thing above all else: that their targets remain unaware of the mechanism being used against them. Simply by understanding these patterns, by being able to name them, you have already taken away a significant portion of their power. The next time you feel that familiar confusion after a conversation, that nagging sense of having done something wrong without quite knowing what, pause. Ask yourself, calmly, which of these patterns might be at play. That single pause, that single moment of clarity, can change the entire trajectory of a relationship, a friendship, or a career. Your mind is yours. Your memory is yours. Your reality is yours to define, not someone else's to rewrite. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. If this content helped you see something more clearly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because we'll continue exploring the depths of human psychology together, one truth at a time.